Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, and thanks to the Canadian, Ugandan, Norwegian team for being so prompt. We are now moving to the European neighborhood area, and we are going to present the work from the Lebanese team. So we are representing the Center for Lebanese Studies. I'm Cathrine Brun, and I have Maria Maalouf with me. We also had Maha Schweib and Shaden El-Daif on the team, but they're not here with us today. I also would like to thank Peter and Kate and the Population Europe for a wonderful organization of all this and for the policy document that also came out of the whole project as our final publication, and Luc, of course, for all the hard work that has meant that we are all here today. We're also extremely honored today to have three amazing panelists with us for this discussion. We will do it a little bit differently than the other panels. We have prepared questions, and hopefully it will be a little bit more of a conversation. So on our panel today, we have Joanna Darmanin from the European Commission, Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, ECHO. Ms. Darmanin has been with the Director General as head of unit responsible for humanitarian aid thematic policies since 2021, but joined the European Commission in 2004 and has had several engagements, including asylum and migration. We have Olivier Pierre Louveaux, who is a lawyer and a public administrator reform specialist, serving as partnership advisor at the UNDP Brussels office to support and promote partnership between the European Union and the UNDP in the Arab states. And we have Robin Vandervoordt, I can't say it completely, I'm going to practice more, is an assistant professor in migration studies at Ghent University's Center for Social Study of Migration and Refugees, and who conducts and supervises ethnographic work along different lines, both solidarity collectives combining humanitarian with political action, but also how migration policies shape the lived experiences of people on the move and vice versa. So I think we have a very rich experience in our panel today, and we are very much looking forward to the discussion. So from here, we will start with Maria, who will present some of the work we did and that we published in the policy brief. So,
thank you. Thank you, Catherine. So, hello, everyone. Through our panel today, we will be addressing the need for a long-term planning and funding to better address the vulnerabilities of people living in protracted displacement situation. By highlighting related findings from the VULNER project, especially when it comes to the humanitarian assistance, and ending up suggesting realistic recommendations for different parties. And our reflections originate in the situation of Lebanon, where we conducted the research with Syrian and Palestinian refugees. Our starting point will be the protracted displacement that begins in unstable and fragile states, causing ongoing insecurities in the region. And people living in protracted displacement in major refugee hosting states, such as Lebanon, are mainly supported with short-term humanitarian assistance by the international community. And speaking briefly about Lebanon's context, it is important to highlight firstly the deep financial and economic and political crisis that add the challenges of residing as a refugee in the country. So, briefly, Lebanon is hosting the most refugees per capita in the world. As per 2022 data of the United Nations, Lebanon is hosting 1.5 million Syrian refugees, in addition to smaller numbers of refugees from Iraq and Sudan, and an estimated 257,000 Palestinian refugees from Lebanon and Palestinian refugees from Syria. Yet, Lebanon doesn't consider itself as a host country, but as a transit country, causing a permanent state of temporariness for the refugees residing in the country. Also, Lebanon is not a signatory to the 1951 International Refugee Convention, and nationally, it lacks a legal regime, refugee regime, and an official homogeneous policy to govern refugees' presence and livelihoods. Consequently, the legal status and level of inclusion of the non-Lebanese population is differentiated. So, from this context, it is important to understand that the Lebanese response to refugees is fragmented into two responses mainly, a security approach and a humanitarian approach, and these two are intertwined and enacted by a myriad of actors. But for the sake of this presentation, we will just focus on the humanitarian response. And this latter is an approach led by non-state actors, but in close alignment with the Lebanese state's institution, facilitated through LCRP, or Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. The humanitarian assistance is centered on a vulnerability assessment led by UN agencies and based on defined categories such as age, gender, disability, in addition to the socioeconomic approach that focused on the livelihoods aspect. Also, this approach defines refugees as a category of need instead of attaching them to rights. And the vulnerability criteria are used to assess eligibility to resettlement as well. But in fact, we can note that UNHCR is not able to provide adequate access to durable solutions to protracted refugee situation. Based on that, what are the impacts of the short-term assistance on refugees' lives? There is a limited understanding among refugees about humanitarian organizations' definition of vulnerability and eligibility criteria for assistance. Hence, the current model of humanitarian aid does not adequately address and may even perpetuate vulnerabilities for people living in protracted displacement. For example, this means that refugees feel stuck into the humanitarian and development model of assistance. Refugees are uncertain about their future in the asylum country. They are feeling lost. They can only think and live day by day. Refugees experience a permanent state of temporariness, and they lack access to asylum and protection provisions, coupled with the security-based approach in the host country, which is the Lebanon's case. Additionally, we mentioned also a significant negative impact on the dignity, security, and economic and social well-being of the refugees. Consequently, we identified challenges of the humanitarian response. First, it does not take into account the existing needs of the refugees. We note also the increasing lack of funding of the humanitarian response indicates that more sustainable solutions must be adopted. Also, the humanitarian organizations operate on short-term projects and funding priorities, and their approaches and priorities often change according to large political priorities and trends. And there is also an important challenge to mention is first, the lack of political willingness of the host countries to consider refugees. They are living on their territories for years as part of the society and to facilitate a longer stay for them, like the Lebanese case. While, on the other hand, we mention as well the Europe governments want to keep refugees where they are than moving to Europe. And lastly, we also mentioned that the challenges are connected, can also increasing, while there is an intersecting economic and political crisis in the country. And lastly, the international community has failed to hold the Lebanese government to account for the conditions. And to open up the discussions, we suggest the following policy recommendations. First, there is a need to consider the root causes of vulnerability that lie within the political and sectarian factors, and there is a need for new support mechanisms. Also, the international organizations should develop criteria based on intersectional, multidimensional, and situational understanding of vulnerability to capture the changing nature of vulnerability on different levels. Also, there is a need to improve representations of refugees for example, the governments, international organizations, and fundings should work with more refugee-led initiatives and representatives to better understand the vulnerability of refugees. Also, there is a need to prioritize monitoring and evaluation from donors, UN agencies, by insisting on greater accountability and transparency of their fundings for effective results in supporting refugees. And lastly, there is a need to increase responsibility sharing among the international community and host countries to increase the resettlement opportunities and to ease the pressure on host countries with mass displacements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I'm sure that if you have more questions to the project and the research, we can also come back to that. I will now move into the conversation, and we will take one question at a time, and we will see how it goes. We only met just before the session, so we have not rehearsed it. So let's see how it goes. I think what's important is that Maria has now given us, in a way, a snapshot of the situation in Lebanon, focusing specifically on the issue of the protractedness and the impasse of solution that we face in Lebanon. Within this, the so-called Humanitarian Development Nexus, the attempt to, in a way, see whether you can think of how lives can, develop within a context of displacement is quite challenging in a country like Lebanon, which is in a very deep financial and political crisis in many ways. So I want to turn to you first, Olivier, and maybe you could reflect a little bit on what the international community can learn from the situation in Lebanon, given it's also quite a specific situation in a way.
Yes. Can you hear? Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this presentation. I'm working for UNDP, and UNDP is a development agency, so it's music to my ear to hear that. We need to work on the longer term, but to see a bit what can be learned from the situation in Lebanon. And indeed, as you just have mentioned, the situation in Lebanon is quite specific. It's very complex from a social, economic, political, geopolitical perspective, and quite unprecedented. But unfortunately, it's maybe not the first or the last time we see such a situation. We can see Tunisia or other countries that are also going the sort of with the state, a failed state. Don't quote me on Tunisia, but it's not going really well in the good direction, and we see it's quite quickly coupled with a migration crisis. But just to come back to Lebanon and to see what we can extract from there. What is important to underline first, I think, is the response to the impact of the Syria crisis in Lebanon, which is, it has been mentioned, the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan is actually, officially, and we can discuss that, it's not a short-term humanitarian response framework by the international community. It's a joint plan between the government of Lebanon, the international and the national partners, and trying to respond to the different challenges in a comprehensive and integrated manner. At short and medium term, with multi-year planning. So UNHCR is dealing with mostly with the humanitarian aspect, and UNDP dealing with the stabilization aspect. But clearly, there is the aim is as well to support the service provision through the national system. So to reinforce as well the Lebanon economic, social, and environmental stability. And actually, we can see that so far the achievement of the LCRP through the government of Lebanon is clearly spanning over the nexus, and the triple nexus, the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Since 2015, actually Lebanon has received over 9.3 billion in support of displaced Syrian, vulnerable Lebanese and Palestinian refugees under this plan. And through, the donor contributions, the different actors I have mentioned, but as well, and that has and should be always underlined, the great and exceptional hospitality of the Lebanese community. But we can see, and due to, if we see how is Lebanon right now, and the crisis, it's really not an easy situation. But I strongly believe that the plan has prevented an even greater deterioration of the living condition of the poorest groups in Lebanon, all of them. And despite this crisis, it has actually, basic services have been so far maintained. But as I said as well, since the beginning, the support to the public institution is a key part of the plan. So to strengthen the capacity of the public service delivery, policy development, institutional stability is really key. But as we know, Lebanon is witnessing a very deep governance crisis, weak state, an eroding social contract, fragmented interest. So there is a vicious circle right now of corruption, and we can discuss the tariff agreements and where we stand here, but that we start another chapter. But let's say that the successive shocks that Lebanon has witnessed and went through recently, the blast, the COVID, all the refugees, have really, revealed the vulnerabilities of the system, and has led right now to an economic and a governance crisis. So as the international community, and that can be actually it's a lessons learned and maybe an option for other countries. What at least UNDP is planning to do is to work in three different it's not phases, three different approaches. One is supporting the stabilization of core local and national government services to ensure a sort of response to the current crisis through basic services. Then simultaneously is to support the design and the implementation of a comprehensive reform agenda. So it's to actually break and reverse the vicious circle that we see of crisis, one after the other that we see. And then it's to work on the linking between the crisis response on the long term with inclusive and green objectives, and we call that the transformation. So we have a sort of stabilization element, reform element, and transformation element. And that it's at local level, but at I mean central and local level, but that I will probably develop the local level afterwards. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We are dealing with a very special. I was just in the parliament in Lebanon to talk to some MPs the other day. They have power 1 hour a day, so it's what the parliamentarians are operating with. So there is a lot to be done. I will move to you, and we will come back to you, Olivier. I will move to you, Joanna, and I don't know if you wanted to stay there or you want to, because of the light. So one of the challenges that we have identified in our text relates to the fact that most situations of protracted displacement in main refugee hosting countries across the world are currently addressed mainly through short-term humanitarian aid. Now, Olivier is maybe saying that it's not the whole story, but I think that still refugees experience this very short-term perspective in the assistance. Can you say a bit more about what you see as the limits to this model and how the EU is trying to overcome them?
Thank you very much, Cathrine. Apologies for this, but the spotlight is just in my eyes, so I'm more comfortable speaking from here. And thank you indeed to Maria for your presentation and the set of very relevant recommendations that you have met. And indeed, it's true that in many of the situations we see today of protracted displacement, the main vehicle to address the needs is humanitarian assistance, and this is very much the core mandate of what DG ECHO does. Every year, the vast majority of our budget, around 80%, is allocated to projects that either address the needs of the forcibly displaced or also the host communities in various contexts around the world. But as you said, Cathrine, the model does come with some constraints, some challenges, and that is the fact that humanitarian response in and of itself is focused on addressing the most urgent needs and the immediate situation that unfolds, and also targeting the most vulnerable situation, and that many aspects related to the more medium and longer term assistance and needs by the displaced do not fall within the scope of the humanitarian response. So this is something that we are constantly trying to grapple with. And as a first element of response, I would refer to the humanitarian development peace Nexus. It does offer a number of solutions. I think that also address a number of the recommendations also that Maria made. And we do try to work together with our development partners and our peace partners in order to develop the Nexus. There is a combined raft of recommendations that we have developed together with our INTPA and INTPA partners and the EAS. For example, there have been letters, joint letters by our Commissioner Urpilainen, by the HRVP Borrell, but also by Commissioners Lenarčič and Urpilainen, in order to make sure that the Nexus is actually taking root on the ground. So there is positive narrative also to tell there. That doesn't mean that it doesn't come without challenges. So we recently conducted a study on the 6 pilot countries where we had tried to dig a little bit deeper into what the situation is on the ground. And there we have good examples and we have bad examples. Also, to make the point that the context at the end of the day is also a key factor in determining how you roll out the Nexus in the various different countries in which we operate. And also there is the key point I think that Maria made. Humanitarian assistance is what it is. The needs are rising exponentially, and the budget is not keeping a pace. So there we have to continue to strive to work across the nexus. If we take, for example, the situation of Lebanon, we do see some positive development in the fact that, for example, some of the main coordination mechanisms in the countries are now engaging more closely with each other. For instance, the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan and the Emergency Response Plan, and this is based on the key principles of the Nexus, if you like, which is to undertake a joint needs analysis amongst the different actors, joint needs assessment, and then finally to try and also roll out better joint programming. There are other ways that we do this. For example, even in the case of humanitarian assistance, we are trying to address the issue of short-termism by means of having more commitment towards multi-year funding. It's not going to be the silver bullet in terms of the solution, but certainly it does provide partners with a longer perspective in terms of how to design the response. Perhaps one issue that I want to say is there are a lot of efforts underway in order to continue to build on the nexus in terms of what we do with our development partners and our peace partners. The challenge is out there. It's larger. You have 87% of most of the displaced people that live, in fact, in developing countries. So we have to continue to make sure that our commitment remains steadfast. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll let you go back to your seat. Thank you. And I think there is a big question in this, which is also, I think, related to how we define development. So maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, because there is also, I think, challenges when we talk about displacement and in that context, development. I would like to perhaps move a little bit more to a people-oriented discussion as well here. And Robin, I want to turn to you, because in your work, you focused a lot on how people help each other. And is there some way that you can see, perhaps, that we can shift the discourse from being nation-state-centric and sort of focus more on the national level to be more refugee-centric in that context?
Certainly, I'll try to provide a little bit of an answer, but also starting by building up also on the recommendations that you've provided, and from the bottom up and from the perspective of accessing services. I think the representation of refugees themselves within services, within research, within policy debates is a central starting point, which everybody knows, everybody talks about, but it's actually very difficult to do it well and to do it systematically. I think that that's a starting point to adapt services, to make sure that they are accessible, and that they also that they revolve centrally around people's needs, and that remains central at all levels. So I think that that's a very good first starting point to begin with. And secondly, when it comes to changing discourses from state to refugees, or to refugees' needs and experiences, I think looking at many places where initially there's a lot of solidarity, that very often this also revolves around shared sense of history, a shared sense of experience. And this is something that initially in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, has also taken place also between different generations of people with Palestinian and other refugee backgrounds within Syria before the Syrian conflict, in solidarity with Palestinians, with people from Iraq as well. But also looking back even up until the 1990s, people in Lebanon also finding refuge in Syria, which initially had quite a big impact also on how Syrians were received in Lebanon. But then there's also the mobility, generally in borderlands across the world, also in places like Brussels that are not literally at the border, but where you see that if people are mobile, and for instance in Jordan, in Lebanon, crossing the Syrian border, that these are networks that initially are very crucial in overcoming this short-term sense of crisis before it becomes protracted, of course. Then there's the element of faith and shared connections based on faith, which in Lebanon can be particularly complicated and tricky, of course, but in practice, if you look at where solidarity emerges, it's very often in this context of faith-based organizations. And then there's the element just of space and proximity, often centered around particular areas, a particular sense of identity that evolves around cities, neighborhoods, large areas that sometimes cross into different state borders. But thirdly, and this is somewhat paradoxically, is I think that there's also a very good argument to make for decentering refugees and refugees' needs in the sense of seeing, for instance, and perceiving and building a discourse also of an economic and a political crisis that is common, that is broader, that expands just the category of people on the move itself. And this is something also looking back at, for instance, in Greece, where initially after, before 2015, there was also quite a lot of local solidarity. You see this also in typical borderlands, islands, where there's actually a very common history that is not revolved around being refugee, but that really revolves around the shared universal approach in which decentering refugees might actually paradoxically help there. And what's crucial in that, and this is central I think in all the recommendations that you've made, particularly in the case of Lebanon, is providing access for people to work, to education, to basic rights. If all those things happen, and if they can build on a stronger state provision, stronger state resources, then you can avoid getting into a vicious circle where you have to focus on short-term vulnerability assessment, short-term vulnerability being central in all kinds of support programs, which you cannot really get out of because the situation the structural causes don't really change.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very important point also to mention that unlike Uganda, where at least after 20 years you could possibly get citizenship in Lebanon by law, you cannot naturalize. So it's a very complicated situation. But I think your point really neatly weaves into my second question to you, Joanna, because our paper also highlights the fact that in Lebanon the refugees interviewed spoke of this very permanent state of temporariness. And this is very much their experience of vulnerability. It's how they explain their vulnerability in many ways. And can you tell us a little bit more about the EU's effort as a development and humanitarian donor to address that kind of vulnerability? And I particularly think you would like to talk maybe about self-reliance in this context.
Being in the spotlight. No, thank you, Cathrine. And indeed, the situation in Lebanon is of great concern to us. Since 2011, DG ECHO has allocated over 860 million in humanitarian aid to respond to urgent needs in Lebanon. Initially, the focus was on supporting the Syrian refugees at the outset of the Syria regional crisis, but due to the deteriorating situation, which I think was mentioned by previous speakers, EU humanitarian support is also now delivered on the basis of needs both to Syrians and Lebanese who need it most. As I mentioned previously, the issue of strengthening the resilience and self-reliance of forcibly displaced is a major priority for us at DG ECHO. And it is something that is well reflected in our everyday humanitarian actions in the context of displacement, including, for example, in Lebanon. Just to give you a couple of ideas in what it is we do in order to help achieve this, in terms of meeting the urgent needs, apart from issues such as shelter, protection, food, and safe water. DG ECHO's assistance also helps affected populations to access education, healthcare, housing, land, livelihood support, and other services in various situations, as I mentioned, both in Lebanon and around the world. So it is very much also an issue that we continue to push for inclusion, because therein, I think the point being made lies a longer-term solution. In terms of other issues that we address, for example, a lot of our support, including in Lebanon, is in the form of cash transfers. I think there you have a message of empowerment to the refugees and independence over how they take their decisions. So that is something that we strongly push for, apart from being an efficiency mechanism in the way that we deliver our assistance, but it also helps in spurring the local economy. So, for example, in Lebanon, DG ECHO supports multipurpose cash assistance to address the needs of Syrian refugees with the now also included caseload of the vulnerable Lebanese since 2002. But in addition to that, EU development funds are also allocated by DG NIR in the case of Lebanon in cash transfer programs which focus on vulnerable refugees, vulnerable Lebanese. So therein you start to see the nexus. Another example where we work with our counterparts in DG NIR is, for example, in the support for education, where we have the standing policy in DG ECHO to allocate at least 10% of our budget to projects to facilitate access to education in context of humanitarian crisis. Many of them will be in displacement crisis. So there we are supporting out-of-school Syrian children to access non-formal education and to try and facilitate this transition into the more formal education, while our EU development funds are allocated to focus more on the formal educational side. If I take, for example, the health sector, there we support access to quality healthcare, including via the procurement of medicines. After there was the cholera outbreak declared in Lebanon in October 22, we started to fund community-based water, sanitation and hygiene interventions in the areas where you had the clusters of the cholera cases, while our development agency, so the development DG, funds are flowing towards, for example, the long-term primary healthcare under the auspices of the Ministry of Health. So many links also on that front. We do coordinate, like I said, with our colleagues in DG NIR, for example, on making sure that our annual humanitarian implementation plans and their plans in terms of fundings and programs are in alignment, and where we can see, there are gaps that need to be addressed, who is going to take this caseload and who is going to handle the longer term, but also to coordinate with externally with other development donors and partners, including our member states, for example. This is something that we discuss in monthly meetings that we have in the COHAFA and the working group that is dedicated to humanitarian assistance, but also with UN entities, the Red Cross movement, as well as with financial instruments such as the World Bank managed Lebanon Financial Fund, the LFF. So there for you a couple of examples on how development and humanitarian actors work together in the case of Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one of the most striking findings we had in our research with both Syrian and Palestinian refugees in our work was how every family, every household we interviewed had the person we interviewed or someone in the household had health problems that had become chronic, that could have been treated if there had been better access to health services, or there had been funding for people to access health care. And the devastating impact of these kinds of problems, where it means you cannot work, for example, it really was very shocking to see exactly how widespread health problem was. So I think this is one of the really key issues in terms of thinking about long-term development as well. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to turn back to you, Olivier, and in your previous intervention you talked about the work that you are doing in a way with the state, the Lebanese state, You mentioned it as a failed state. You mentioned corruption. I think it's also important to mention the multiple campaigns that the state has had about the return of Syrian refugees. Last July or June, they announced that they would return 15,000 Syrian refugees a month. And it resulted in some detentions and some returns. Then about a month ago, they restarted this campaign and they started returning, and they, I think, managed to return about 500 Syrian refugees. They tried to, there was another 500 that they tried to return, but the Syrian regime did not want them. And we're not quite sure exactly we know partly the reasons, but we have no details about this. So it's easy in this case to, think about the requirements that we should have towards the Lebanese state for hosting refugees, to make them more accountable towards fulfilling the rights, and to make sure that Syrian refugees in particular live in dignity in Lebanon. But I also think that, seen from Lebanon, that we do feel that there is a responsibility towards the international community to also think about how, in a small nation state like Lebanon, hosting relative to its population the most refugees in the world, I think only bar to Arua, I think, which is a small island state. So in that context, Olivier, are there responsibility sharing mechanisms that you see in your role as being between the EU and the Arab states, in the way that we could think of in terms of finding solution? Is there any way that reality could be improved from how we see it today?
Thank you. Thank you. It's not an easy question. No. To start with, and to jump on what you have just mentioned, I think, indeed, the way the international community and the UN agencies, the international partners of Lebanon are working with Lebanon in the current context, as I have mentioned, it's really to ensure as well, to support Lebanon, but to ensure as well ownership of the Lebanese. And I will develop on saying that actually, we to support them and to respond to those basic services, and then I will come back to the responsibility sharing aspect. There is a need from a strong or national government or authorities, and so there are some opportunities actually at that level to work. We have in the UNDP tension monitoring mechanism, which is actually a very complex mechanism which allows us to identify the tensions at all levels between, at the beginning it was really to monitor the situation, the refugee situation, but then with the deterioration of the situation in Lebanon, it was as well to monitor the tensions between the Syrian and the Lebanese, or even between Lebanese now. So clearly the context is changing, it's very volatile. So it's the way we would like to, I'm jumping to the next, but first, the tension monitoring system has actually underlined that the population and all, I don't want to make a distinction within the population. They still trust actually the army, the police, and the municipalities. And that was especially clear during the COVID, where when municipalities were seen as undertaking actions And then, you know, it was clearly visible to communities, and it has reinforced as well in some places. So we want to support the authorities at central level, but we will clearly as well work and develop the municipal level or the local level, and to develop an integrated and local development and governance program. I say that because I think in your question, in the responsibility sharing, it's not only the national states and the international community. It's much more complex than that. There are all the municipalities, and especially in Lebanon, I will not say the municipalities or the local level is the panacea, because clearly the sectarian aspect is present there as well. But still, it's another level where actually the social contract can be built, and where actually concrete solutions can be found for Lebanese and for Syrian or all the refugees, Palestinians, etc. Because I think it's dangerous to generalize as well, and to say this is, especially in Lebanon, there is not one situation, it's all very different and very, very fragmented. Responsibility sharing mechanism between the Arab states and the EU, and as UN, you know, it's a very dangerous question. Now, but the thing is I may just say that at this stage, we would like to, as UN, we really would like to underline the importance, as you have mentioned, of the long-term development, to tackle the root causes of migration, not for to keep the refugees where they are, but it's a question of dignity. And right now, actually, if you look at the budgets in the EU, there is a change. Recently, you had, for example, this Africa Trust Fund, which, I mean, the objective was to deal with the migration in the in North Africa, but it was possible through this budget to fund development projects to tackle the root causes of migration. Right now, due to the political situation in Europe, those budgets have been split, and it's much more difficult for all colleagues in the EU, in NEAR in this case, working on development, to use those budgets. And those budgets are not used anymore for development, but for shorter term response to migration. And that's not going in the right direction. So I will be more optimistic, and to say that we will build, those responsibility sharing mechanisms. But at this stage, I think it's very, very political, and I think the response has to be political.
Thank you. It's of course disappointing to see that from Lebanon, but we of course know that it is a difficult question. But it's I think when you're in Lebanon, it feels like there's a lot of talk and even in the compact mentioning responsibility sharing, and it's a constant disappointment somehow. But I know that it's also a very difficult question. Robin, I would like to come back to you for the last question, and really come back to the question I started with, and seeing it from your research. What can we learn from Lebanon for refugee situations in Europe?
I'd like to take a little bit more of a distant perspective in that regard. Just looking back also historically, and also in the much longer term, I think if you see in situations of mass displacement that there's actually a lot of people, or in a lot of places across the world, that initially there's quite a lot of solidarity and support among people on the move themselves, with local citizens, local communities, local organizations, even local state actors, municipalities, self-organization. That there's a very strong tendency for refugees to also self-organize themselves, and that if they are supported, and if this is done in a structured way, and this is followed up by access to rights, etc., and to capacity building, that people can really achieve a lot together. But that if they are left to themselves, and if you have a differentiation of rights between different groups of people on the move, but also between citizens and people who, who are not even recognized as refugees, and if you then have a compounding situation of an economic crisis, a weakening state or a weak state, then it becomes very, very difficult, or almost, it basically becomes impossible to tackle the causes of vulnerability. And what you also receive then is what then emerges are tensions, of course, between people, within people on the move, because you have a scarcity of resources, you have a protracted situation for everyone, and that is something that is very difficult to turn back to, or to undo. So taking that longer term perspective, I think that when we see these crises emerging, if we seize the opportunity to build on those solidarity structures that do emerge every time something like this happens in a new context, that a lot can be prevented and a lot can be done in a different way. But I'm not sure how useful something like this is in the Lebanese context.
Thank you so much. I feel that maybe both what you are saying and what Olivier said about the local level here, there is something that's also about extending that solidarity across the region, so across Europe and the Arab region, for example, so that we also maybe can think about those in a different way. This was very interesting. I have so many questions and so much more to discuss. Of course, we're talking about the really big political questions, and we're talking about experiences and how the experiences actually are at the core of those big political questions in a way. I would like to open up, I think we have a few minutes for discussion and questions. And I have a little bit, I think Sophie has her hand up. Yes.
Thank you for a very riveting discussion. My question is for Ms. Darmanin. You mentioned something about CBTs, cash-based transfers. I'm curious to know if you know how much they give people in Lebanon, because in my research in Uganda, people who are very vulnerable get €3 per month for food. Who are less vulnerable, €3, and if you're very, very vulnerable, it's €5 per month for food. So when you talk about exercising agency, I wonder how much agency one can exercise with such amounts. You also talk about multi-cash purpose transfer. It doesn't, the amounts don't differ much, and when they talk about exercising agency, they say you can use it for food, but also business. So it's very well packaged. But in practice, the way it's given out, if you're giving somebody €5 per month for the next 5 or 6 months, because it also is short term, what kind of business could they offer? Could they open? So when it comes to individual households, someone who's getting €5 per month in the hope that they'll become self-reliant, that's almost inachievable. It can only happen, and in very rare cases, where people belong to a big household and they pool their resources. So I'm curious what the experience in Lebanon is. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. And I'm sorry, I simply can't look up. No, I don't have the details with respect to what we call the minimum expenditure basket when it comes to Lebanon, but I know there are a number of technical calculations that go into the calculation of the needs, vulnerability, and then a basket is set for the various countries depending on a pretty complex set of indicators. So I cannot tell you exactly what that minimum expenditure basket is, but to make 2 points of principle. Number one, it's more about empowerment in the sense of giving to our beneficiaries the option to choose on how to spend their money. in the longer term, it's not really about aiming to open businesses or anything of the sort. I think that is exactly the sort of activities where we would like to see our development partners focus on. It's not for the humanitarians to deal with issues such as self-reliance in the longer term. But it helps. It helps to give a bit of empowerment, that you say to someone, I'm not giving you a bag of rice, but here there is money, and see what you think and prioritize in terms of how you would like to feed your children. On the amounts, again, a complex calculation, very, very technical. But I mean, to make the point that indeed the situation may not be the most optimal the world over, because there is an increasing problem with the amount of money that we have available to spend in the increasing number of crises. So there is a lot of pressure. We see, for example, that in many very vulnerable countries, our partners are cutting food baskets, cutting everything. There simply is not enough money to meet the needs of the rising caseload. And there, you mentioned, I think, you mentioned Cathrine. Our commissioner has repeatedly engaged on the issue of trying to address this funding gap, and there are various ways of doing it. One of the issues is, for example, expanding the donor base, so reaching out to those donors where we feel they can contribute more to the humanitarian situation that is developing globally. We are, for example, also piloting together with international financial institutions in order to try and see how private funding can also be put at the disposal of the humanitarian situation. It works in the case of development, so we're trying to see how this can work in humanitarian assistance, and other ways trying to always be more efficient to make sure that the little amount of money that we have, we get the most efficiency in terms of being able to meet the needs of people. But it is not ideal. I agree with you, and if we had more, we would be able to give more.
Thank you. Maria, would you like to say anything about? I mean, in Lebanon, there's a collaboration between several of the international organizations, and they have a pool, and they give systematically to a high proportion of Syrian refugees. We could, in this project, we tried repeatedly to get an interview with the UNHCR in Lebanon, but they never wanted to talk to us, which has been the story of Center for Lebanese Studies in Lebanon for many years, unfortunately. But through the interviews, we understand that families get about 100,000, 1 million lira. It's difficult with because of inflation. 1 million lira, which is about
1 year before now.
Yeah, about a year ago, and that's about $100. So yes. Any other? Yes, thank you, Ireland.
Hi, Ireland Posky from the Norwegian Institute for Social Research. I have a question for DG ECHO. The thematic report on cash and multi-purpose cash grants that came out a couple of years ago made some very bold statements about the advantages of using cash in programming. And this is in line with I think, like broader humanitarian developments, the UNHCR, the World Food Programme, the OCHA, like various UN agencies are also moving towards cash. I was wondering, like, have you received any kind of pushback on it? Is there any critique? Are there anyone who disagrees with this movement to cash? And if so, like, what are the counter arguments, and who are the actors questioning this shift? Thank you.
I need to give you a diplomatic answer. I think in principle, I think there is an acceptance by the major donors that cash-based interventions is the way to go, and I think there is a commitment. The reception to that principle and how it's implemented on the ground is uneven. So some partners are more ready to engage, for example, on the cash agenda, others less so, and there will be specificities behind the reason for this. So, for example, we push cash very strongly, for example, with WFP, who is one of our main partners. But now what we see, since we adopted our guidance, I think it was in March last year, that even now they have a policy document that they have put up, and I see also statements by the new head of the WFP, Cindy McCain, that she wants to focus very much on cash-based interventions, etc. But then you also have to take into account the fact that, for example, the EU is not the only donor to someone like WFP, and they will be receiving from other donors, other very large donors, in-kind assistance. And what are you going to say? No? So there are a lot of different reasons where in some contexts it may work and it may work well, in other contexts not so much. You also have the reality of the infrastructure. So even if it's cash-based interventions, you need to have a minimal amount of connectivity in order to be able to deliver it. So I think it will depend context by context. You also have a situation where, for example, some national governments inside countries do not want humanitarians to operate on cash, because of what they say are problems with perceived inequalities of a host community and potential problems there. But as a matter of principle, I think we try to take it case by case, see where it is we can make inroads and make the advocacy for cash programming, because certainly in terms of the efficiency that it brings, it is unparalleled. So that is something that we will continue to push. It's never going to be an even success story across the board, but certainly something that DG ECHO invests a lot of time in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think our time is up. It's a coffee break, I think. So I think maybe if anyone really has any burning questions, please join us for the coffee break. And please, if you have time to stay a few more minutes. Thank you so much for your reflections. It was really, really good.